presentation is a little more fun, besides the samples that Shelley will have at the end. Okay, who are millennials? The common reply is they're the worst because they feel entitled, they feel impatient, they're lazy, self-conscious, and unhappy all the time. And they're described as narcissistic and purpose-starved. I'm not sure that's helpful. I'm pretty sure that's not right, but that's the way they're presented. In researching this presentation, I came across a quote that said all those nasty things about the younger generation. Of course, the quote was 2,000 years old. It was from ancient Rome. So I suppose it's just something older people do about the younger people. Let's talk about it more technically, because they do have an impact on real estate, and they will have an impact on how you practice appraisal in the future. Here are the millennials right here, basically born between 81 and 96. These are the other generations. I guess I'm down here in the boomer generation. Gen X and Gen Z, we don't seem to focus too much about them for the following reasons. Millennials are a huge population cohort. Let's look at it. Here are the boomers. We were the largest for decades, but now we're getting older and we're kind of disappearing. Hopefully not too soon for us. But boomers are the largest, and they will continue to expand a little bit, probably because of immigration. But they will be the largest generation through 2050 and beyond. So whatever they do will be reflected in markets, including real estate markets. So what are they? Who are they? They're often described as digitally native. They grew up with computers. That's why Dennis is here today and helped us set up with this technology. More importantly, they're ethnically and racially diverse, highly educated, and they are highly indebted for their age, and that's probably because of their education. And they also are quite a bit underemployed. Let's look at some of this demographics. The moral of the story is one size won't fit all. And to give you the punchline as far as appraisal goes, whatever it is you knew before about real estate, and whatever you had to learn to get proficient at the real estate that you do, you're probably going to have to get even a little more specialized and know more specialties, because properties are not going to be one size fits all for all these categories. Okay. Here's a breakdown of the race. Obviously, if you look at just white alone, 84% of the boomers, 74% rather of the boomers, 84 for the silent generation, much smaller cohort. They're going to behave differently in real estate. Millennials are much less likely to be married at this point in their life. Millennials are 46% married between the ages of 25 and 37 compared to our parents, which were 83%. Huge change. So right there, what are you going to build if you're going to build housing? Are you going to build Levittown's anymore? You're not. You're going to build, at least some of it is going to be single rooms, studios, one bedrooms, and often in urban areas. And we'll talk about the urban area issue a little bit. Amongst millennials, this is interesting, women are now more likely to go to college than the other generations. Gen Xers to a degree, but there's not as many of those. Again, that changes the way we position real estate and the way we manage real estate, and who's going to manage the real estate. They are in debt. Millennials are in debt. And since debt is a huge part of real estate, when you finance real estate, this is having a big impact on who owns real estate, when they buy real estate. And it's really quite dramatic when you think about this bar over here is not the 1950s or the 60s. This is only a little more than a decade ago. And look how much the indebtedness has increased for college education. Some of this up at the top here is 60 plus, and I would assume some of this gray area here, the 50 to 59, that's probably parents who are co-signing loans for their kids. That's me. I'm in that category. I paid off my loans in my 20s. Now I have new loans in my name for my kids. That's probably impacting even our generation's ability to buy real estate, invest in real estate, etc. This is a big issue for real estate. The workforce is quite different, and there's a sad component to the story. Not as many millennials are working, and especially amongst men. And that's probably because some of them are doing maybe other things socially, which would be a benefit. Some commentators are suggesting that the reason that this is lower is because of the opioid epidemic. I didn't believe it at first, but I saw their arguments, and it looks like they have a pretty good argument for why millennials are not working as much as the other generations. This is the same chart, but this is for women. Women have made fantastic strides in the decades. And so, of course, that means they also have money and will be buying real estate. Median income. While we like to think of them as lazy, they actually are fairly productive when they finally do work. Millennials make more than Gen Xers, Boomers, at the same age group, even when you account for inflation. This is adjusted to 2016 dollars. So millennials, when we can get them working, do good. We just got to figure out how to get them all working. Where they live. 88% of millennials are living in what this report from Pew Research suggests is a metropolitan area. I'm not clear whether that means suburbs or not, but compare that to whatever that measure is to the silent generation and to the boomers. That's a fairly big switch. A lot of my parents' generations moved out of the city. I did. I was born in Philadelphia, moved to Levittown, but I did move back to a city in my 20s. Now I'm, of course, back in New Jersey with kids in the suburbs. So how does this impact the real estate that they own? They suggest that they're moving back to the cities. Now, that is basically true. However, the argument is a bit more subtle than that. Let's look at some of the finer details. And it's also having a big impact on the quantity of construction. If you look at where millennials are moving, it is towards the cities, and you can see where you might expect to see the construction. It is the top 10 markets account for 45% of all the construction in 2017 for apartments. And it is in all the big metropolitan areas. Denver, of course, not out here, a little bit out here, but it's the 10 biggest markets. And it is in urban areas. Apartment supply continues to grow above the long-term average. Apartments have, let's just say they're in the 150 to 200,000 units per year for a number of years. We went into a recession here. Obviously, there's a lag. The data suggests a lag in the response to a recession. But we've come out of it quite strong. And that what appears to be 19 appears to be above even the recent years. I'm a believer that recessions are inevitable when it comes to economics. They just don't go on forever like this. At some point, we're going to have a slope down. I don't know when it is, but this data doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. And that data does appear to be outside of the experience we've had in recent years. Or in the longer term, rather. So how has this impacted cap rates, for example? This orange line is the cap rate line since 2002. 2008 through 11-ish was pretty bad. But we are still, for a number of years, way down here below what appears to even be the best years in the early 2000s. I don't know how long that can continue. If I had money, I didn't have indebtedness from my kids' loans, I probably still wouldn't buy an apartment building at these kind of cap rates. But I'm sort of a bear on markets. I'm not a bull. But plenty of people do think it is in the 5% range on average for the country for cap rates. You can break it down too. It appears to be across all categories. Primary, secondary, and tertiary cap rates are all experiencing some rates that are historically low and stable for so many years, as opposed to the quick decline and the quick up that we saw in the early 2000s. And that is in part because of millennials. Because millennials are buying different kinds of real estate. They are moving from 2000 to 2013. There you can see the increase here, and every bit of data I've seen suggests that millennials are in fact occupying more space in urban areas. And if you go to the hipster neighborhoods, you'll find that those particular niches where you have a drawl of some sort, like a Hoboken, certain sections of Jersey City, Brooklyn, Queens, those are those hyper urban neighborhoods, they get the millennials. Now, it isn't that way for everyone. Not everyone is moving back to the cities. As you can see, older people are moving out still. Those without bachelor degrees are not moving to cities. In fact, are moving out of cities. It's mostly your better educated, professional, younger folks, younger millennials. Urban population declining since the 1990s. What this table suggests is the numbers are about the same, but from 84 to 2000, 2014, there seems to be an inflection point in the way millennials are moving. Again, be careful about making broad assumptions about how millennials behave in real estate. You have to be a little bit more detailed about it. Even though they don't own, and maybe they don't care to own, and that's kind of what this suggests. If you look at this data here, people over 55, 39% of people who don't own a home say, I don't think I'm going to want to ever buy a home. Maybe millennials will end up there, but right now they're at 93% saying they would like to own. Did I get that backwards? 39% say they would like to own. That means 61% would not like to own. Where millennials are saying 93% would like to own. Someday maybe that number will look like that number for that cohort when they get to be 55. We'll have to see. What's holding them back? Part of it is the indebtedness. For me, I didn't get married until later. Didn't leave the city until I had 2 kids who started elementary school, and it was back to New Jersey. Okay. If you look at the demographics by age group in different years, again, you'll see that millennials have accelerated their move to urban areas, while other groups have moved out as they age. And this, I think, for the older generations, that corresponds to basically buying a home in the suburbs for kids, which is probably what's going to happen to millennials too. But they seem to have postponed that activity until later in life. Okay. Suburbs are still the place that people want to live. I just think we're going to see the millennials do it later. And when they do, they're probably not going to move to what my parents had, which was a Levittown house, which is a small Cape Cod. They're going to move to the McMansions that they're building down in Monmouth and Ocean County, and maybe even out in Hunterdon where I live. Or they're going to want an upscale urban environment closer to the city, like in Bergen County. I'm sorry, in Hudson County. This is interesting. If you look at the top graph, from 1950 to 2016, roughly 20% of households were multi-generational. Doesn't seem like there's much of a change. But what you have to remember is back in 1950, there were only 32 million people in that demographic. Now it's at 64. You've doubled the number of multi-generational houses in that period of time. That housing stock needs to be different than what was in the 1950s. So if you're a builder and you need to build for 32 million additional units, are you going to build a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. That might have been good enough for a multi-generational house back in the 1950s. That's not going to be accepted today by somebody who has a college education. Residential trends. They're moving back to the areas, but in certain areas, and they're moving back into a different housing stock than our parents left when they moved out of the cities. They're postponing their first home purchase. And they're living with their parents in their basements. My son lived with me after he graduated for about 18 months in my basement. He's since moved on to Denver, but Hunterdon County apparently is first in the country for children living in their parents' basements. I'm one of them. And their quality of life and their expectations about their entire life, including their housing and their retail and their workplace, is much different than we had. It impacts everything. Our entertainment, their entertainment, which means entertainment and real estate, cultural amenities, everything from restaurants, and all the usual things have to be built out differently for millennials. They're also having an impact on manufacturing and industrial space. The single biggest thing is maybe not something that they caused, but certainly it's happening during their generation, which is the switch to e-commerce. So let's spend a few moments talking about that. This is a line since just 2009 of the percentage of total retail that happens online. And it's just no end in sight. It's just going to keep going like this for years. It's been going like this for years. Amazon is the big 800-pound gorilla. They have a huge percentage. This chart may be a year old. I'm sure this is even higher now. If you look at the next group of 10 retailers, a relatively small percentage. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I can tell you, even if it's not Amazon, if it somehow gets divided up by antitrust, the activity of online retailing is not going to change. And that's going to have a huge impact on real estate. Here's one slide to demonstrate the point. A brick and mortar retailer needs about 400,000 square foot for $1 billion in sales. An online retailer needs about almost 1.2 million square feet for $1 billion in sales. Okay, they need a lot of warehouse space because it goes straight from the warehouse to your door. It doesn't go into a display at a Macy's or a Walmart or whatever like that. It goes straight to you. So every time I drive down the turnpike, through the sections of exits 7 and 8 and those areas, I just can't get over the huge buildings that are going up. I also travel quite a bit for my my power plant and utilities work around the country. It's not just in New Jersey. Everywhere you go, you'll see the old and ugly warehouses, and then you see these monster buildings out amongst the cornfields. And it's just amazing. The demand for this warehousing is also getting subtle, where for years we've always assumed that manufacturing on a second floor or warehousing on a second floor was obsolete. Nobody wanted that space. You wrote it off, you wrote it down, and made a big adjustment to your cost approach for the obsolescence. Not necessarily true anymore. In fact, some of these e-retailers are building multi-story warehousing space. They're doing it because it allows them to place the warehouse very close to the end consumer. And for distribution purposes, that saves them a lot of time and money. It's worth it for them to build the extra space, to complicate their operations on multiple floors, and to pay more for the land because they're buying in urban areas as opposed to down in central Jersey where land may be cheaper. This is a national thing. This is not just happening in the several cases I present here. And in fact, it's international as well. They're building these kinds of spaces everywhere. Now, does that mean the old spaces are suddenly going to come back and find a consumer? Maybe not. These newer spaces are specifically designed. They have the types of ramps needed to get trucks up and down to the right floors. But maybe some of those older ones will. I lived and worked for the city of New York for years doing a lot of their economic development, they had some military spec buildings where you could bring trains up to upper floors. I kind of wonder what will happen to some of those buildings. Right now it's filled with offices, but if they weren't offices today, I wonder if they could reuse them today for distribution and warehouse like they were used before. Okay. Now, e-retailing is good for consumers. It's not good for some retail brick and mortar stores. And this is a story you all have probably heard from some of your taxpayers. And does not seem to be slowing down. The number of store closings has been high in recent years. 2017, this data is, I guess, a little bit older. I have some newer charts here. Employment change from previous year. The number of stores that are closing looks bad for brick and mortar. Here's 2018 data. They're going to Toys R Us, 700 stores going out. As I look over the list, I think I see a little bit of a trend here that it's the specialty stores that seem to get into trouble on occasion. I didn't even know some of these stores existed. On one of them was a chain of bicycle shops. I didn't know that was there. I think it's on this one here. Yeah, bicycle shop. They've tried every concept. Some of them are succeeding, some of them aren't. But even some traditional store types are still closing on a regular basis, numbers, dozens of stores. That does have an impact and changes the value of our malls if it's not the right kind of a mall. So what's happening to our malls? What we're seeing is the kind of mall that does well has more of the quality of life services like restaurants and entertainment. So you'll see restaurants with Cheesecake Factory and upscale Chinese restaurants, as opposed to stores that were just a department store. For example, they closed JCPenney's and put in a Costco. I'm not sure that's much of a change, but it is a discount, so it's a little bit of a change in concept. This is interesting. They changed to Davidson's and they put in all these stores here, which are all lifestyle things. And that is a national phenomenon. The old style, simple mall, simple concept from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s may not be sufficient. Some of those malls are going to get repositioned. Some of them may become obsolete. So what does the mall look like for the new millennial generation? Basically, the story is it's going to have more types of activities. It's going to have some more upscale and some also maybe discounts. And it's going to have just a broader range of activities. The mall next to us, a little strip mall, now has Taekwondo next to the McDonald's. McDonald's probably wouldn't have accepted that years ago, but then 20 years ago, the mall probably wouldn't even accept it at McDonald's. So, the character of our malls are changing. We're going to have to be more flexible how we analyze whether there's obsolescence and demand for those. Okay, two particular case studies. Data centers and recreational marijuana. I've been doing this for 33 years, and you kind of get thinking, I've seen everything. And then maybe 5 years ago, I did some data centers and realized this is a whole new class of property. It is not like what it looks like on the outside. It looks like a traditional warehouse distribution building. And if you look inside, talk about the fire code, from the previous presentation. That looks like a warehouse. Look down here, you see things stored, basically. But that's not the whole story with data centers. As somebody who does utilities for appraisal of utilities on a regular basis, I was blown over by the utilities that are in these buildings. They have just some of the most intense utility usage I've ever seen, and redundancy like I've never seen. These companies aim to support their customers, their data user customers, to what they call 5 nines or 6 nines. They want a 99.9999% reliability. So they try to position these facilities at the junction of two power lines, not just one. So if one power line gets hit by a drunk driver, they still got power. And then they'll also have backup generators with enough supply to run for what seems like an excess amount of time before they run out of fuel. They'll often be on the crossover of two telecom lines. So again, if something happens, a railroad goes off tracks and digs up a fiber optic cable and cuts it out, they have another fiber optic cable coming into these facilities. Location for these data centers is really important. I don't know how we captured that in the appraisal, but if they're putting a data center there, they're paying for that location. They need to be in that location. And then they also need water, like you would never expect in a warehouse. So what happens when you build one of these? You get something that looks like this. They look like factories. But you won't see teams of tradespeople walking around working these. You might see a half dozen cars and people walking around. It looks like a scene out of a science fiction movie where there's just nobody left. But everything's buzzing and glowing, and the computers are all going crazy. Yeah, I recognize this equipment as water tanks, water purifiers. They have to have killer AC to keep all that computer equipment cool. And it is a national phenomenon to the point now that there are REITs who specialize in data centers around the country and around the world. They go out and they build these buildings and host consumers who need data storage and data processing. Google's doing it, but there's also these REITs, and then there are just general companies that will do it. Some of the big Wall Street firms have their own centers. They spend a lot of money, and because they need these special locations, they'll repurpose properties that are obsolete. Coal is not doing good these days. Coal power plants are on their way out for a number of reasons. It's not because of the regulations, maybe in part. The big issue is natural gas is just so much cheaper. It's taking coal out at the knees. It just can't compete with natural gas. The old coal plants, for the most part, are just being retired. However, because they are at a crossover, often, of power lines, they make an ideal location for a data center. Some of these coal plants have impressive industrial buildings which can be repurposed. Google is doing it in a number of places, and makes it good for them. Here's a couple of examples of what's happening. So Sears had a building that's being repositioned into a data center. Chicago Sun-Times had a very heavy industrial building for their printing being repositioned as a data center. Old historical buildings. This looks like a heavy-duty building. These buildings do require quite a bit of security, as you might imagine. They're pretty intensive to get inside them. And it's happening abroad. I think I mentioned that. Okay. So what are the implications? Here's the bottom line. If you looked at a normal warehouse, you'd say maybe $50, $75 a square foot. Okay. You could argue a little bit about the range there. Data centers, $500 a square foot? Probably higher. Now I know Marshall and Swift showed some numbers this morning in the 200 range. I couldn't quite see 200 to 300. That's a big difference. I'm chalking that up to how you classify this in here. And that's one of the issues with data centers. How do you classify the real property versus the personal property? We can spend a lot of time talking about that. My feeling is if you put in AC to safeguard either people or equipment in those buildings, that's probably real property. If you put in AC as part of a process that's changed some chemical or material into another chemical or material, that's probably machinery and equipment related to an industrial process, not taxable. But look at this building here. The utilities are so intense. Everything has to be color-coded because the engineers who run these buildings can't keep track of it otherwise. It's truly spaghetti. I've been in nuclear power plants that looked less confusing than some of these data centers. But of course, these facilities are much more colorful. And So that raises questions about the highest and best use, the go dark issue, and this is an issue that's come up because of technology in this generation. It used to be these buildings were built by the users. Google built its own data centers. Now there are REITs who are building these buildings and leasing out the services or the space where you bring in your server or your mainframe and you plug it in and have the support of the rest of the building. In the beginning they were making the argument that it was investment in personal property at a business value. I don't know that they can get away with that anymore. I think they should be assessed more towards this number than that. But these haven't yet worked their way through the courts. Okay, this is the last topic here. The ending of the prohibition of marijuana. It has, we can put aside the politics for a second. Let's just talk about the impact, the financial impact on real estate. So let's look at it. Where are we? These states have already decriminalized recreational, or how are they calling it? They're calling it legalized recreational marijuana. We're going to do a case study in Colorado and in Washington to see the impact on real estate. New Jersey came close to legalizing it last week. I'm told that it'll probably happen after the election, because at this point they're going to wait until after the election so nobody has to run against their record. A couple of states have done it a while ago, 2012 for Colorado and Washington State. Massachusetts, Maine, a bunch of New England states have already done it, and a bunch of states are considering it. And so let's take a look at the impacts. It's pretty big. Imagine with the stroke of a pen, you create literally hundreds, sometimes thousands of new businesses. And as you might expect, the businesses tend to be in urban areas. Here's 122, I'm not sure what category this is. 63 in Boulder. They have some outside. Let me give you some tallies of where these things are and how they're divided up. It's more than just selling them pot. You actually have to grow it, and then you have to process it. So there's 3 types of space needed for the industry. Growing ops, 1 year after legalization, they had 400 permits or licensees. As of the beginning of this month, there were 700. Just in those couple of years, that's a 68% increase. So it's not slowing down in Colorado. That's 700 operations, employees, real estate that need to be catered to. That's the growing. That's kind of like the farming. Then you have to process it, and they do more than just roll it. They, as you may know, they make edibles and they make medicinals. All of them have different processes. There's 283. That's up 188% since that seems to be the growing segment that nobody realized was a market. Retail stores up 75%. Of course, everybody kind of knew that was going to keep growing. So you have 1,500 new businesses since 2012 needing all kinds of real estate, industrial, farming, processing, and retailing. And we'll talk about what kind of retailing they need in a second. Impact on industrial vacancies. We were in a recession back here, so we were coming out of it, and there was a decline. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that this vacancy rate is purely the result of just the improving economy. Both of these states legalized here, and the vacancy rate is, even by New Jersey standards, which has always had a very strong industrial market, is 3%, 4%. That's really good. I can't help but believe that marijuana with demand for 600 new buildings is causing that vacancy rate. The same is true on the rental rate. In fact, that hasn't even leveled off. Since the legalization in both states, the rental rates have been above, I don't know, where do they start building? Where would you say? $9 a square foot, everybody will start building. $8 maybe. So they've been past that point for a number of years, and it still seems to be going on. Maybe I should just clarify that they need manufacturing space even for the growing, because it's required by law, and that's required for the security. You don't want to grow this in an open field. Marijuana is grown inside buildings. So the buildings are kind of special. It's a general purpose warehouse, but it has to have good heating, good plumbing, and a lot of electric for the lights. Okay, retail vacancy. This is an interesting one. Most of the national retailer REITs, for example, will not accept marijuana retailers. So what happens is that the retailers go to Class B and C space. It might be like an old former single-family home along 17 that is at the end of its economic life, and now here suddenly you're going to have a retailer who wants in. But again, security is a big issue. A lot of these retailers will have reinforced entries and blocked out windows for security purposes. And in both areas, rental rates have gone up. And again, we were coming out of a recession, but I think you'd be hard pressed to argue it's not in part that these increases are not in part because of marijuana. Okay, so sort of the same issues at the end of the day. If you go into a warehouse and start growing, and you put in this intensive lighting, is that part of the process, or is that part of the real property? They have special drainage here. They have special watering. They probably have enhanced heating and climate control. Is that part of the real property, personal property? You'll have to figure that out as the assessors. That'll be what we'll probably fight about. But this is a much more expensive building than your ordinary warehouse type building. It will increase rental rates. New Jersey's always had a strong industrial market. Class B retail, maybe this will help them. That's not particularly strong in the state. We will see lower vacancy rates, and it will stretch the longevity of some of these plants. My guess is what will happen is that we'll see these growers move out to the western, northwestern, and the very southern parts of the state. They can transport their finished products relatively easy. It's not bulky, it's not heavy. So they'll pick the areas where property is cheaper to rent. They don't need to be next to New York or Philly. Let's see, and that's that. Okay. Millennials are a huge demographic. And one way to think about this is if you have a minor shift in a demographic, what does that mean? So if somebody says, oh, our population is growing 1%, in most contexts, for most analyses, whatever it is, cap rates, whatever, 1% is not a big deal. A 1% vacancy adjustment, 1% growth in values, it's not that big of a deal. A 1% change in demographics is a big deal. If we have a 1% change in the population of New Jersey, what are we, 7, 8 million people? 1% change means we need another 70 to 80,000 housing units. I don't know any builder who wouldn't like to hear that. They need 70 to 80,000 building units. When you look at the demographics of what millennials mean, this change amounts to huge changes in the profile of our real estate in the next couple of decades, and it will mean not just we're all going to move to one-bedroom apartments in the city. It's going to this particular group, because it's not just they're buying later, they're just ethnically more diverse. They tend to stay in families longer. We're going to need just a greater variety of real estate and a switch to a different kind of quality. That's it. Questions?
Mark, where does Uber and Lyft come into millennials?
They use it just like they dial a phone. These days they don't dial, they just text. They just use it all the time. I use it even in New Jersey. I use it. I mean, they just take this as stride in their life. For us, it's kind of exciting and new. For them, it was just always the way life has been.
They're replacing Uber with cars.
Yes, they are.
Driver's licenses.
Yes.
So parking inner city parking at some point will become less cumbersome,
Right.
okay? They will tend to be living in the city, and they will not get their driver's license until they're 35 years old and decide to move into mom and dad's place, right?
That could be. However, they don't love cars like my generation did. Getting a car was like a really big deal. Freedom, independence. But my kids expect a car. Now, if they moved, to New York, would they take a car? I don't know. My daughter, both my kids took cars to school. But they also will Uber, and I encourage it because I don't want them doing bad things and then driving home. So how will it impact? I don't know. Is it going to impact parking lots? That's why we're all going to have to spend a little extra time thinking through these issues because,
I can't think that far.
yeah, it's not going to be, our job's not going to get easier because of millennials and all the changes we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.